For most of your life, you've carried a quiet suspicion about yourself. It shows up in the pauses between conversations, in the half-finished notebooks, in the browser tabs you never quite close. You look back at your path, and it doesn't move in a straight line. It zigzags, it branches, it doubles back on itself. And somewhere along the way, you learn to translate that shape into a story about who you are. Unfocused, indecisive, inconsistent. You've probably used harsher words in private. You've watched other people choose something and stay with it. One direction, one identity, one ladder to climb. And you wondered why that never seemed to fit you, no matter how hard you tried to force yourself into it. You didn't lack effort. You didn't lack discipline. If anything, you worked harder than most, trying to make yourself smaller, simpler, easier to explain. And every time a new interest appeared, something inside you tightened. Not excitement, guilt, because you had learned that curiosity was dangerous, that wanting more than one thing meant you'd never truly have anything. So you tried to pick. And the moment you did, another part of you went quiet. You stayed, but you felt hollow. You left, and you felt ashamed. Eventually, the shame became the explanation. This is just who I am. I never stick with anything. I always ruin my own progress. That explanation feels familiar, because it's been repeated to you, directly or indirectly, your entire life. But it's wrong, not emotionally wrong, structurally wrong. The belief that something is broken in you didn't come from insight. It came from a world that only knows how to measure one shape of mind. For a long time, success belonged to people who could narrow their attention and keep it there, depth over breadth. One problem, one skill, one identity. And when that became the standard, anyone who didn't fit it learned to feel defective by comparison. But psychology has a quieter truth it doesn't always advertise. Human minds are not uniform instruments. They are adaptive systems. And some are built not to stay inside one domain, but to move between many. If your attention naturally scans, if your curiosity leaps, if your mind keeps asking, what else? That isn't a failure of willpower. It's a different cognitive orientation. Your brain is optimized for pattern recognition across contexts, not repetition inside a single one. Where some minds gain energy by refining the same motion again and again, yours gains energy by discovering how different systems rhyme with each other. You don't just learn things, you notice how they relate. This is why sticking to one narrow path eventually feels suffocating. Not because you lack commitment, but because your mind needs movement to stay alive. And here's the part no one tells you. This kind of mind isn't meant to be shallow. It's meant to be layered. The problem is not that you go wide. The problem is that you were never shown how to go deep more than once. So you tried to do everything at the same time. Or you tried to cut parts of yourself off completely. Neither worked, because depth for a mind like yours doesn't look like a single vertical tunnel. It looks like multiple pillars built over time. This is where the story begins to change. There is a version of you that isn't scattered. It's sequential. A version that doesn't abandon interests, but completes seasons with them. That doesn't dilute focus, but rotates it. Neuroscience calls this transfer, the ability to carry structural understanding from one domain into another, not surface facts, deeper patterns. The reason you can't explain this easily is because our language for intelligence is outdated. We talk about mastery as if it only counts when it stays in one box. But some minds are designed to build bridges, not towers. They see the same shape hiding inside different problems. They recognize familiar tension in unfamiliar material. That's why learning something new doesn't reset you to zero. It adds dimension, even when it feels unrelated, especially when it feels unrelated. Your past interests were not distractions. They were inputs. Raw material your mind was quietly storing, not for completion, but for combination. This is why you feel restless when you try to lock yourself into a single identity. You're not betraying your potential. You're protecting it. But protection has a cost. Carrying this kind of mind without understanding it is exhausting. You live with constant mental noise. Ideas stack faster than you can process them. Possibilities multiply instead of narrowing. And because the world rewards clarity over complexity, you start performing certainty you don't actually feel. You downplay interests. You rush decisions just to stop the internal pressure. You mistake relief for alignment. That relief never lasts. Because the part of you that scans doesn't disappear when ignored. It just turns inward. And that's when the doubt grows louder. Not because you're failing, but because you're misaligned. The truth is uncomfortable at first. You don't need to become someone else. You need an environment that stops punishing the way you're wired. An environment that allows depth in sequence. Stability without confinement. Exploration without chaos. This is where many people make a dangerous mistake. They assume honoring this trait means indulging every impulse. It doesn't. It means choosing focus without self-erasure. It means understanding that commitment doesn't have to be permanent to be real. That leaving something after mastery is not quitting. It's graduating. And that idea alone, if you let it land, changes everything. Because suddenly, your past doesn't look like failure. It looks like unfinished architecture, strong foundations that were never connected. And maybe for the first time, you start to sense what's been missing. Not discipline, not passion, structure. A structure that holds curiosity instead of crushing it. That realization doesn't arrive loudly. It arrives as a pause. The kind where nothing needs to be decided yet, only understood. And you stand there, quietly, between who you thought you were and who you're beginning to recognize. Not fixed, not broken, just finally seen. What comes after that pause is not a plan. It's permission. Permission to stop forcing your life into a shape it was never meant to hold. Because once you see this clearly, another truth surfaces, one that's harder to ignore. The discomfort you've been carrying was never a personal flaw. It was friction. Friction between how your mind actually works and what it's been asked to perform. A mind like yours evolved for variability, for scanning terrain, for noticing weak signals before they became obvious. In earlier environments, that kind of awareness wasn't optional. It was survival. Someone had to notice when patterns changed, when food sources shifted, when threats didn't look like last time. That role required breadth first, depth second, and the ability to move between both. But modern systems don't reward that easily. They prefer predictability. They prefer specialization that can be named, packaged, and repeated. So, you adapted. You learned to compress yourself. You learned to talk about your interests like they were phases. You learned to hide enthusiasm until it felt safe. You learned to call your curiosity a problem before anyone else could. And over time, that constant self-editing took a toll. It shows up as mental fatigue that doesn't go away with rest. As a low-level grief you can't quite place. As the sense that you're always one decision away from locking yourself into the wrong life. That fear is rational, given the options you were shown. But those options were incomplete. You were taught that stability and exploration are opposites. That depth requires sacrifice. That choosing one thing means killing the rest. That's not how it has to work. Stability doesn't have to come from passion. And exploration doesn't have to come from chaos. Sometimes the most self-honoring choice is not the most exciting one. It's the one that creates space, a role that holds the ground steady, that doesn't demand every ounce of your attention, that leaves your nervous system intact at the end of the day. Not because it defines you, but because it supports you. When you stop demanding that one job satisfy every part of you, something relaxes. You no longer need it to be meaningful, expressive, transcendent. It just needs to be sufficient. That sufficiency is not settling. It's strategy. It's how you protect the part of you that actually generates meaning. Because your value doesn't come from constant output. It comes from synthesis, and synthesis requires space. This is where boundaries matter. Not boundaries against the world, but against your own tendency to overextend. You don't need to chase every interest the moment it appears. You don't need to turn every spark into an obligation. Curiosity doesn't need immediate action to stay alive. Sometimes it only needs to be acknowledged, captured, set aside. Your mind produces more raw material than it can process in real time. That doesn't mean it's out of control. It means it needs somewhere to put things down. When you externalize your thoughts, when you stop forcing your memory to carry everything, your mind does what it's always wanted to do. It connects. Ideas stop competing for attention. They start forming relationships. And months or years later, something unexpected happens. A pattern clicks. A problem opens. A solution appears that didn't exist inside any single discipline. That's not accidental. That's how this kind of mind pays off. Not quickly, not loudly, but deeply. This is why trying to fix yourself never worked. You were trying to optimize for a system that wasn't designed for you. The real shift begins when you stop asking, "How do I become more consistent?" and start asking, "What kind of consistency does my mind actually need?" For you, consistency is not sameness. It's rhythm, seasons of focus, periods of rest, cycles of depth, followed by integration. You don't need to commit forever. You need to commit fully. For now. To give one pillar your attention, long enough that it can support you later. Not as a cage, as a foundation. And when the time comes to move on, you don't need to justify it with burnout or resentment. You can leave with clarity. Because leaving after growth is not escape. It's completion. That reframing changes how you carry your past. Instead of seeing abandoned paths, you start seeing stored capacity, skills waiting to be combined, experiences waiting for context. Your life stops looking scattered. It starts looking multidimensional. This doesn't remove uncertainty. It softens it. You still won't have a single sentence that explains everything you do. You may never fit cleanly into one category. But you won't need to, because the pressure to be easily understood was never meant for minds like yours. Your work happens in the space between, in the quiet translation from one world to another. That's not a flaw, that's a function. And when you stop fighting it, the anxiety changes shape. It becomes attentiveness, care, discernment. You move more slowly, not because you're stuck, but because you're listening. Listening for alignment instead of approval. For resonance instead of certainty. And in those moments, when nothing dramatic happens, when no decision is made, you begin to trust yourself in a new way. Not because you finally chose one thing, but because you stopped trying to amputate the rest. That trust doesn't announce itself. It settles, quietly. And if you're honest, you can feel it now. That sense that maybe your life doesn't need to narrow. Maybe it needs to connect. And maybe the most important question isn't what you'll choose next, but how you'll hold space for what hasn't revealed its purpose yet. If you want, we can keep exploring that together.